And good morning, Warsaw. Today it's Wednesday, 2nd of August. It will be very cloudy with rain with highs of 18 degrees Celsius. That's 64 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:13 a.m. and sunset at 8:42 p.m. We are on the second day of the Warsaw Uprising. Guys, please tell us more. What is the situation on the ground? Because I can get a feeling that people are getting excited.
Thanks again for that really great intro, Philippe. But I want to come back to something that we were talking about yesterday, and that's clothing. And I want to explore that just a little bit more. Roger, did you want to add anything to that conversation?
Right. Yeah, no, as we were saying on the first day of the rising, I think all insurgents in Warsaw are basically not in uniform, of course, because it's an underground army, right? So when they actually come out on the streets, whether it's at 5 o'clock in the evening or at other times where some of them went prematurely, they are coming out on the streets with the only item that identifies them is usually a red armband to identify them. That changes already on the second and on the days that follow when insurgent forces actually managed to capture German stores in the city, some of which contain the archetypal Stahlhelm, the German helmets, but also particularly SS uniforms, camouflage uniforms, these camouflage smocks, which actually only the SS used in German forces. But a lot of these fall into insurgent hands. So you see some of the photography from the period. You can see insurgents wearing these German-style helmets, usually with a red and white sort of bandana across it, but also wearing these SS smocks that they'd captured.
And some of the women, I mean, it was seen as a notable thing. So if a young lad was wearing one of them, that was really the thing to be wearing as a young resistance fighter. So that gave them a real certain kudos or cachet as well.
What's really interesting is that there are so many photographs of insurgents wearing these SS uniforms and the camouflages and smocks and helmets and whatnot. And if you go onto Google, I think probably between 1 to 2 out of every 10 photographs will show this type of uniform. They're so widely popular amongst the insurgents. And I was having a conversation with a couple of friends of mine who were doing reenactment for the Warsaw Uprising. And until I showed them the photographs, they didn't believe me that this is one of the uniforms, quote uniforms, that the insurgents would wear.
Yeah.
Even though building barricades began on the 1st of August, it's interesting because it carries on to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. Insurgents continue to build these barricades. Claire, you've got a couple of really interesting anecdotes on this. What kind of materials were being used for the barricades?
Well, I mean, first, what are these barricades? They are across streets to division and partition certain areas of the city, but they're also to create vital conduits, routes that people can run across the city, messengers, soldiers, suppliers with food and more ammunition, that sort of thing. And they're made of all sorts of things, whatever the insurgents could get their hands on. So there are accounts of people, tearing up the paving stones, but they would use all sorts of big stuff. They ripped out from parks, the fencing from parks, but they also used overturned trams from the city's trams, which of course not running. You get some wonderful photographs of young men on these overturned trams overlooking. They used huge wooden reels from the city's cables factory, which they could obviously roll into place. So they were really useful. Park benches, and as the uprising goes on and there's a lot of, there's some bombing, there is the rubble from the buildings as well. So all of these things are shored up.
Something we haven't mentioned is Hitler and Himmler's reaction to the Warsaw Uprising. And I want to read a quote because this was announced by Himmler on the 1st of August. Quote, "Every inhabitant of Warsaw must be killed, no prisoners of war to be taken, and Warsaw must be razed to the ground. This is to be an example to the whole of Europe." This is a very extreme reaction by Himmler. In the following days, we'll learn what this actually means.
Warsaw has been a blight for Hitler throughout, the level of resistance throughout the occupation. It's not where any of your German officers want to be sent. They want to be sent to Paris, where they can have champagne and walk around with a Baedeker. In Warsaw, it's not like that. So it's becomes this real focus of anger for the senior leaders of the Third Reich. So you have Himmler on the 2nd of August reporting to Hitler, the action of the Poles is a blessing. We shall finish them off. They see this as an excuse to decimate the city. And Hitler he's already livid. He's still recovering from the 20th of July bomb plot, which, luckily, unfortunately, he survived. And he's absolutely incandescent at the news of what is called skirmishes at this point. It's not called an uprising. They just belittle it and call it skirmishes. And so when he's informed that, he wants to send the Luftwaffe out and completely just bomb the whole of Warsaw to the ground, but he's told that they can't do that without immense German casualties. So he demands that this city is leveled to the ground by other means, and that every inhabitant in the city, every inhabitant is to be killed. And he specifies men, women, and children.
And that, of course, speaks to the racial prejudices of the Nazis, of course. That there's a huge difference in the way they see the Poles versus the way they see the French or the Danes or the Dutch. They fundamentally see the Poles as being, lesser forms of life, so little short of vermin. So in an example such as this, if the Poles have the temerity to rise against German rule, as they obviously have done, then the response from someone like Hitler is to crush them with all force. It's a very different attitude to what you saw elsewhere in occupied Europe.
And so this leads to some appalling massacres, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And we're going to be talking about these in the next few days and quite a lot through this podcast. In regards to the second day, if anybody's watched this series Time of Honor, which I highly recommend, or Czas Honoru in Polish, there is a scene in one of the episodes that portrays what I'm about to talk about really, really well. And that's to do with the idea of human shields, where the Germans would ransack a house or just find civilians and shove them in front of their tanks or their forces, which would stop the insurgents from shooting at them. And then the insurgents were put into a very, very, very difficult position because they didn't want to shoot innocent women, children, even men. So these insurgents were put into a very, very difficult position. Do they shoot or do they not? And this allowed the Germans to be able to advance in certain areas and be able to take buildings and important strategic points.
So yeah, there's very serious massacre at Mokotów prison in the west of Warsaw, which is of the ordinary prisoners that had been held there, would have been captured by the Germans over the previous few months. And on day 2 of the rising, they're taken out. 600 of them taken out into the prison courtyard and massacred by the SS. And this is just essentially a sort of the Third Reich's version of tidying your room, as it were. If the Poles are going to rise, this is what's going to happen. You're going to do away with those that you have already under your control. There was another massacre of Jesuit priests, I think, Alina. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, there was 40 priests massacred at the Jesuit monastery. Nobody is safe at this point. As I reiterated earlier, Himmler stated that every man, woman and child, everybody in Warsaw deserves to be completely eliminated. What's very interesting is we have a testimony by Stanisława Koprowicz, but we can't include it in this episode because otherwise it's going to be just a little bit too long. So if you head to our Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, you'll be able to hear her testimony there. And any other extra ones we'll be having will be posted up on our social media.
There is still momentum among the insurgents, isn't there? I mean, the Germans haven't brought in any reserves yet, and the insurgents are still working to their plan. So what are the successes? What are the targets they take on the second day?
We already briefly mentioned this in the first podcast, and that is the capture of the power plant. It was officially captured today on the second day of the uprising. We got a really fantastic testimony, actually, by Vincente Shantar, who is the man who actually laid the explosives at the power plant. And I think his words are far more powerful than me being able to explain it, because he was there and he experienced it himself.
Now that I had an exit, I lit the fuses, which were quite long, a few meters. I then jumped outside through the exit with my friend. There was always a German guard there. A German patrol was in the area. But somehow we didn't come across a German patrol this time. We ran further. Then there was an explosion at that moment, and there was still a need to hide somehow. We ran to the main building and to the turbine room of the power plant. It turns out that a German patrol was on the way. They even fired at us, and some plaster flew at us from the building we were jumping into. We got to the main buildings and joined the partially armed power plant workers who were already fighting the Germans. We joined in and also started fighting the Germans. The others made me the leader of this insurgent movement, but these were not any special orders. But just in case it happened that they were killed, because even though we killed some of the Germans, other Germans were still hiding.
The power plant's really important. It manages to power the whole of Warsaw for nearly 30 days up until the old town falls, and then the attentions are turned onto the area Powiśle, and that falls around the 6th of September. So they managed to power quite a lot, which is really important for the insurgents to be able to have telephone communication, radio communication. Some of the other really interesting points that they managed to capture are the printworks, for example. Printworks are able to publish various different propaganda material, which we will talk about later in the podcast, where we touch on propaganda. So there are some successes that happen. We will talk more about other successes on other days, because we still have 60 odd days to be talking yet, and we have lots of ups and downs. So we'll talk a little bit more about those when the time comes.
There's also just, one of the sort of profound and most damaging shortages that the insurgents had throughout was of any sort of heavy armour, and they actually captured their first piece of heavy armour on the second day, which was a Panther tank, Panzer Mark V, captured by the insurgents, repaired. It was sort of mildly damaged in the event of its capture, was repaired and put it back into insurgent service. And they christened it Magda, of course, and that served with them through much of the rest of the Rising.
Those are some absolutely fantastic successes, but I want to add in a not so successful moment in the Warsaw Uprising. This moment actually begins on the 1st of August, so the day before, and units in the region of Ochota, which is more or less in the western southern sort of district of Warsaw, they didn't manage to capture their initial targets, and they also suffered some absolutely horrific losses. So therefore, on the night of the 1st and the 2nd of August, the troops decided to pull back from Ochota to the south. At about 5 a.m, they reach one of the villages, which is just before the village of Pięcice. Bit of a mouthful, I know. And that's not far outside the forest either. So the marching insurgents are at a complete disadvantage at this point with the terrain that they're in. So the Germans are at a much higher vantage point, and they can see the insurgents marching. Suddenly, when the insurgents reach a dike, the Germans appear and a massive clash breaks out. At first it looks like the insurgents are going to win, but the sounds of the fighting alerted German troops that were stationed in the next village over in this SS reinforcements arrive, 2 tanks and a reconnaissance plane. 300 insurgents managed to break through the German attack, and they managed to get into the forest. They regroup, they rearm, and then they set off and join the battle later on in August. But the big question is, what happened to the ones that were remaining? There were really heavy losses, with about 31 injured and 31 killed. However, 67 insurgents were captured, 7 of them were released, but the remaining 60 insurgents, including 5 women, are horrifically tortured and then shot by the Germans at about 6 p.m. in a local brickyard. And there's a beautiful memorial there. I really highly recommend people to go there and have a look, in the village of Pięcice. Before we finish and move on to something else, I just want to add one more point that we haven't made, and we'll come back to this point quite a lot, and that's to do with, in quotation, foreign fighters, and it will come up quite a lot through the podcast. But this is about the Jewish fighters who joined the uprising, and I want to talk about Itzhak Zuckerman, who was the head of the Jewish Combat Organization. He became the commander after the death of Mordechai Anielewicz during the ghetto uprising. He was an outside liaison with the Poles when the uprising happened, and he ended up staying on the Aryan side. And he hid there right up until the 1st of August, when he was ready to fight alongside many other people. And he made an appeal on the 2nd, on this day, he made an appeal to the Jews of Warsaw to rise up against their common enemy. And they do. With Zuckerman, he creates his own Jewish combat platoon, and they join the Polish People's Army, and they are the only exclusively Jewish platoon within the Warsaw Uprising. Others end up joining. So, for example, some would end up joining the first platoon they could find. Halina Paszkowska, we heard her testimony by her granddaughter earlier yesterday. She's one of those. She joined straight into the first platoon that she could find, and she became their liaison officer. Also, she's my heroine. I love this woman. So, of course, she's going to appear in this podcast constantly. Others were also involved with the underground before this, so they ended up joining their units that they had already been part of. It's quite odd because we're quite unsure to how many Jews took up arms, as most of them fought under fake Polish names and died under those names too. Some of them never revealed that they were Jews because they were worried they'd be treated differently, or they were scared that they'd be hit by a stray bullet. But this wasn't always the case, really, because in some units Jews were accepted as fighting the common enemy, so they continued to move forward. There were also many Jewish doctors that couldn't ignore the Hippocratic Oath, and they spent 24 hours a day, every day, helping the wounded, and some of them don't survive the Warsaw Uprising. Again, I'm going to bring up Halina Paszkowska. I'm going to quote her. It's a rough quote from her that when I interviewed her many years ago before she died, I asked her, what were your feelings about the Warsaw Uprising? And she said to me that I truly felt free for the first time in 5 years thanks to the Warsaw Uprising. Okay, enough of me talking. Roger, one thing we haven't mentioned at all is what the Germans are up to. Tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Well, the one thing that they certainly are doing is putting out a call for reinforcements to come to Warsaw. As we said, the problem that the insurgents had, of course, was that the Germans don't keep going westwards. They actually sort of turn and fight. So they're also calling fresh forces in for that battle. So they reinforce themselves. They put the call out for there are 2,000 police are brought in, and you have the message comes back that they would be reinforced with 8,000 of Bronisław Kamiński's Cossack brigade. This was a sort of turncoat brigade of most of them, I think, were Belarusians actually, but this is turncoat brigade of Soviet citizens and soldiers who had been sort of fighting largely in inverted commas on the German side. They'd committed a large number of atrocities already, and it was a large group as well. It had a large sort of camp following of civilians with it as well. So it's a really quite peculiar unit. But they would become extremely notorious in the days that were to follow. So the message comes through that they will be arriving in the days that follow. So massive reinforcements, which is, of course, one of the things that the Home Army can't do. So the Home Army is rather stuck with the population of Warsaw, those that are willing to help them, of course, the vast majority, but still they are lacking armaments, they are lacking weaponry, they are lacking heavy armour, and they can't draw on large numbers of reinforcements that the Germans can. So this exposes a fundamental disparity between the two forces.
Thank you so much for joining us for the second episode of this podcast series, and we will see you tomorrow for day 3.